Ma'am, I need you to step aside. Now, Security Chief Marcus Wellington barked, his voice echoing through Terminal 3 of Metropolitan International Airport. His cold gray eyes bore down on Dr. Amara Thompson, a 45-year-old black woman who was simply trying to catch her flight to attend her daughter's medical school graduation ceremony. The leather portfolio in her hands contained the surprise she'd been planning for months. At 22, she was one of only 3 black students in her medical school class, enduring subtle and not-so-subtle racism from professors and classmates alike. At 28, she'd been mistaken for a nurse so many times during her residency that she'd started wearing her credentials pinned to her scrubs. But Amara had never let the doubters win. She'd graduated valedictorian from medical school, completed her residency at Johns Hopkins, and spent the next 15 years building the most successful cardiac surgery practice on the East Coast. Her patient survival rates were legendary. Her surgical innovations had been featured in medical journals worldwide, and her practice had expanded to include 12 locations across 4 states. What made this morning's flight even more special was the gift carefully tucked in her leather portfolio, deed papers for a $2.3 million private practice facility that she was surprising her daughter Zoe with at graduation. Zoe was following in her mother's footsteps, graduating as valedictorian from Harvard Medical School, and Amara wanted to give her the one thing she'd never had, a head start in a world that would try to tear her down. But there was something else about Dr. Amara Thompson that made this moment of discrimination particularly ironic. Something that Security Chief Wellington was about to discover in the most humiliating way possible. 3 years ago, when Metropolitan International Airport was facing bankruptcy and potential closure, it had been Dr. Thompson who stepped in as the silent investor. Through her private equity firm, Thompson Holdings, she had purchased controlling interest in the airport, investing $47 million to modernize the facilities, expand the terminals, and yes, upgrade the security systems. She now owned 73% of Metropolitan International Airport, making her the majority shareholder and effective owner of the very building where she was being humiliated. The irony was almost too perfect to be real. The woman being treated like a criminal owned the ground everyone was standing on. Marcus Wellington had been working in airport security for 12 years, and in his mind, he'd seen it all. At 52, he carried himself with the swagger of a man who believed his badge gave him unlimited authority to judge who belonged in his airport and who didn't. He'd started as a basic TSA agent and worked his way up to security chief, a position that had gone to his head in the worst possible way. Wellington came from a middle-class family in suburban Ohio, where his father had been a police officer and his mother a school administrator. Growing up, he'd absorbed the casual racism that permeated his household, the kind of prejudice that was never spoken aloud, but was communicated through worried glances when black families moved into the neighborhood, through locked car doors when driving through certain parts of town, through the assumption that people who looked like Dr. Thompson were somehow less deserving of respect, less likely to belong in first-class lounges or business meetings. His 12 years in airport security had only reinforced these biases. He developed what he called his instincts, really just racial profiling dressed up in the language of professional experience. He was the kind of security chief who would wave through a disheveled white businessman without a second glance, while subjecting impeccably dressed black professionals to aggressive questioning and invasive searches. Wellington took particular pride in what he called maintaining standards at Metropolitan International. In his twisted view, he was protecting the airport's reputation by making sure certain people knew they were being watched. He'd perfected the art of selective enforcement, finding minor infractions to justify deeper searches, extending routine procedures into lengthy ordeals, and using his authority to make passengers feel unwelcome without technically breaking any written rules. His colleagues had learned not to question his methods. The few who had spoken up over the years had found themselves reassigned to less desirable shifts or facing disciplinary actions for unrelated infractions. Wellington had built a culture of fear among his staff, ensuring that his discriminatory practices went unchallenged and unreported. What made Wellington particularly dangerous was his ability to maintain plausible deniability. He never used racial slurs or made explicitly racist statements. Instead, he relied on random additional screenings, routine bag searches that somehow weren't routine for everyone, and standard procedures that seemed to apply more frequently to passengers of color. This morning, seeing Dr. Thompson in her expensive clothing and carrying her leather portfolio, Wellington's prejudices had kicked into overdrive. In his mind, she was putting on airs, trying to act above her station. The combination of her race, her obvious success, and her dignified bearing triggered every insecurity and bias he'd been harboring for decades. He had no idea that he was about to make the biggest mistake of his career. The morning had started normally enough. Dr. Thompson had arrived at the airport 2 hours before her flight, as she always did, and had proceeded through the check-in process without incident. Her first-class boarding pass was printed smoothly. Her luggage was tagged and sent to the plane, and she'd made her way to the security checkpoint with time to spare. It was at the metal detector where things first went wrong. "Ma'am, please step through again," the TSA agent had said after Dr. Thompson's initial pass through the detector. This wasn't unusual. Sometimes jewelry or belt buckles could trigger the sensitive equipment. But when she stepped through a second time and the machine remained silent, Wellington himself had appeared. "I'm going to need you to step aside for additional screening," he'd announced, his voice carrying the authority of someone who expected immediate compliance. Dr. Thompson had been through this before. As a successful black woman who traveled frequently for medical conferences and consultations, she'd experienced her share of random additional screenings. She'd learned to remain calm, comply with requests, and document everything mentally in case she needed to file a complaint later. But this screening was different. Wellington wasn't just following protocol. He was making a show of it. "Remove your shoes, your belt, and your jacket," he'd commanded, though other passengers were walking through the line with their shoes on. "Place all items in the bin." As Dr. Thompson complied, she noticed Wellington's eyes scanning her expensive watch, designer handbag, and the leather portfolio she carried. She could practically see the wheels turning in his head, the assumptions he was making about how she'd acquired such nice things. "What's in the portfolio?" he'd asked, though it had already been x-rayed and cleared. "Business documents," Dr. Thompson had replied calmly. "I'm going to need to see them." This was where the situation had started to escalate beyond normal procedure. Portfolios containing business documents were rarely opened unless there was a specific security concern flagged by the x-ray machine. But Wellington was on a fishing expedition, looking for any excuse to extend this woman's ordeal. The threat was implicit, but clear. Submit to his authority completely, or face the consequences of missing her daughter's graduation. Dr. Thompson had looked around the security area, noting the other passengers watching the interaction with various expressions of discomfort, curiosity, and in some cases, approval. That's when she'd made a decision that would change everything. "I want to speak to your supervisor," she'd said, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being taken seriously in professional settings. Wellington's face had darkened. This was the moment he'd been waiting for. The moment when he could really flex his power. "Ma'am, I am the supervisor. I'm Security Chief Wellington, and this is my checkpoint. You'll follow my procedures, or you'll be escorted out of this airport." The watching passengers had started pulling out their phones. Some were recording openly. Others were texting frantically. Social media posts were already being uploaded with hashtags like airport discrimination and hashtag racial profiling. But Wellington was too focused on his power trip to notice the digital storm brewing around him. What happened next would have been shocking to anyone who hadn't been paying attention to Wellington's pattern of behavior over the years. But for the staff members who had worked under him, this was just another Tuesday morning display of his selective enforcement policies. "I'm going to need you to submit to a full pat-down," Wellington had announced, calling over a female TSA agent who looked distinctly uncomfortable with the request. "Sir," the agent had whispered, "the metal detector didn't trigger, and the X-ray was clear. Is there a specific?" "Are you questioning my authority?" Wellington had snapped, loud enough for everyone in the area to hear. "I'm the security chief, and I've determined that this passenger requires additional screening. Are you going to do your job, or do I need to find someone who will?" The female agent had reluctantly complied, performing the most thorough pat-down possible while apologizing quietly to Dr. Thompson. Meanwhile, Wellington had turned his attention to the portfolio, emptying its contents onto the screening table for everyone to see. The documents that spilled out told a story of incredible success and generosity. Medical degrees, board certifications, hospital privileges, and most significantly, the deed papers for the private practice facility that Dr. Thompson was gifting to her daughter. The papers clearly showed the $2.3 million valuation and Dr. Thompson's name as the purchaser. But instead of being chastened by this evidence of Dr. Thompson's legitimate success and resources, but Dr. Thompson wasn't just standing there taking abuse. She was making mental notes, cataloging every violation of protocol, every discriminatory comment, every abuse of authority. And she was also making a phone call of her own. If you believe Security Chief Wellington was completely wrong to treat Dr. Thompson this way, type justice in the comments right now and tell us, what would you have done if you were about to discover that the person you were humiliating actually owned the entire airport where you worked? Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss incredible stories like this one. Because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind. While Wellington was radioing for backup and making increasingly inflammatory comments to the growing crowd, Dr. Thompson was having a very different conversation on her phone. She'd stepped slightly away from the immediate chaos, though she was still clearly visible to everyone in the security area, and had placed the call to someone who would change the trajectory of this entire situation. "Marcus, it's Amara," she'd said quietly into her phone. "I need you to conference in Rebecca, James, and David immediately. We have a situation at the airport." Marcus Chen, her head of security for Thompson Holdings, was one of the most connected people in the private security industry. Rebecca Washington was her chief legal counsel, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in civil rights cases. James Rodriguez was her media relations director, and David Kim was her operations manager for Metropolitan International Airport. Within minutes, all four were on a conference call, listening as Dr. Thompson calmly described the situation unfolding around her. "I want full security footage from all angles," she'd instructed. "I want the personnel files for everyone involved. I want a complete review of all TSA procedures and training protocols. And I want to know if this is part of a pattern of discriminatory behavior." What her team discovered in the next 10 minutes would have shocked even Dr. Thompson. Despite her years of experience with institutional racism, David Kim, reviewing the airport's internal incident reports, found 17 documented complaints against Wellington in the past 2 years alone. All 17 complaints came from passengers of color. All 17 complaints had been dismissed as unsubstantiated or routine security procedures, and all 17 complaints had been handled internally, with no external oversight or investigation. Rebecca Washington, accessing federal databases through her legal connections, discovered that Wellington had been flagged by the ACLU 3 times in the past year for potential civil rights violations. Code Red was Thompson Holdings' internal emergency protocol for situations involving potential civil rights violations or threats to passenger safety. It bypassed all normal chains of command and gave Dr. Thompson's team direct authority to intervene in airport operations. As she'd been speaking, airport police had arrived at the checkpoint, and Wellington had started explaining his version of events to the officers. But his narrative was about to be challenged in ways he couldn't imagine. 15 minutes later, the atmosphere at Checkpoint 3 had transformed completely. What had started as a routine security screening had become a full-scale incident involving airport police, TSA supervisors, and now a team of people in expensive suits who had appeared seemingly out of nowhere. Marcus Chen arrived first, flanked by 2 security specialists who immediately began reviewing the checkpoint's camera footage on mobile devices. Marcus was a former Secret Service agent who had been recruited by Dr. Thompson 5 years earlier. At 48, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had protected presidents and CEOs, and his presence alone was enough to change the dynamic of any situation. "Excuse me," he'd said, approaching Wellington with a professional smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm Marcus Chen, head of security for Thompson Holdings. I believe there's been a misunderstanding here." Wellington, still high on his power trip, had barely looked up from his conversation with the airport police. "I don't know who you think you are, but this is a TSA security matter. Airport security handles airport security. If you're not law enforcement, you need to step back." That's when Rebecca Washington arrived, her heels clicking authoritatively on the airport floor as she approached the group. At 52, she was a woman who commanded respect in any room she entered. Her silver hair was perfectly styled. Her suit was clearly expensive, and the leather briefcase she carried bore the embossed logo of Washington and Associates, one of the most prestigious civil rights law firms in the country. "Actually," she'd said, her voice carrying the precise diction of someone who had argued cases before the Supreme Court, "I think you'll find that airport security answers to airport management, and airport management answers to the airport's ownership. I'm Rebecca Washington, Chief Legal Counsel for Thompson Holdings, and I represent the majority shareholder of Metropolitan International Airport." The airport police officers had exchanged glances. They were starting to realize that this wasn't just a routine passenger complaint. Wellington, however, was still too deep in his own narrative to understand what was happening. "Look, lady, I don't care what fancy law firm you work for. This woman," he'd pointed at Dr. Thompson, "was being uncooperative and presenting suspicious documents. I was doing my job according to TSA protocols." "Actually," came another voice, "I think you'll find that your actions this morning violated about 12 different TSA protocols, not to mention federal civil rights laws." David Kim had arrived, carrying a tablet loaded with surveillance footage and a thick folder of documents. As operations manager for the airport, he had access to every security camera, every incident report, and every personnel file in the building. "I'm David Kim, operations manager for Metropolitan International Airport," he'd announced to the growing crowd of officials. "I've been reviewing this incident in real time, and I can tell you that nothing about this security screening followed standard procedures." He turned his tablet toward the airport police officers, showing them a split-screen view of Dr. Thompson's screening, alongside footage of other passengers going through the same checkpoint at the same time. "As you can see," he'd explained, "Dr. Thompson was subjected to additional screening, despite triggering no alarms and presenting no security concerns. Meanwhile, this passenger," he'd pointed to a disheveled white man carrying a suspicious-looking backpack, "was waved through without any additional screening, despite setting off the metal detector twice." The evidence was undeniable. The discrimination was captured in high-definition video from multiple angles. But Wellington was still fighting. "That's taken out of context," he'd protested. "Every situation is different. I use my professional judgment to determine." "Your professional judgment?" Rebecca Washington had interrupted, opening her briefcase and pulling out a thick folder. "Would that be the same professional judgment that resulted in 17 complaints for discriminatory behavior in the past 2 years? The same professional judgment that led to 3 ACLU investigations? The same professional judgment that somehow only targets passengers of color for additional screening?" The color had started to drain from Wellington's face as he realized that these weren't just random lawyers who had materialized out of nowhere. These people had access to information that he thought was buried in bureaucratic files. "I don't know what you're talking about," he'd said, but his voice lacked the confidence it had carried just minutes before. That's when James Rodriguez arrived with the final piece of the puzzle, and the most devastating revelation of all. James Rodriguez was a master of media relations who had spent 15 years managing crisis communications for Fortune 500 companies. He understood the power of information, the importance of timing, and the value of public opinion. When he arrived at Checkpoint 3 with a team of reporters and camera crews, he brought with him the kind of attention that could make or break careers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he'd announced to the crowd, his voice carrying over the chaos with practiced ease. "I'm James Rodriguez, Director of Media Relations for Thompson Holdings. We've invited members of the press to witness the resolution of this incident because we believe transparency is essential when addressing issues of discrimination and civil rights." The reporters had immediately begun setting up their equipment, their cameras focusing on Dr. Thompson, Wellington, and the growing crowd of officials. Social media had exploded with live coverage, and the hashtag airport discrimination was now trending internationally. But James had saved the most important revelation for last. "Before we address today's incident," he'd said, "I think it's important for everyone to understand exactly who was discriminated against this morning. Dr. Amara Thompson is not just a passenger traveling through Metropolitan International Airport. She is a renowned cardiovascular surgeon, a successful businesswoman, and most importantly for this situation, she is the majority owner of this airport." The silence that followed was deafening. Wellington's face had gone from pale to ashen as the implications of what he was hearing sank in. "That's impossible," he'd whispered, but his voice carried no conviction. David Kim had stepped forward with his tablet, showing the official ownership documents on screen for everyone to see. 3 years ago, he'd explained, when Metropolitan International Airport was facing bankruptcy, Dr. Thompson invested $47 million through her private equity firm, Thompson Holdings, to save this facility. She now owns 73% of the airport, making her not just the majority shareholder, but effectively the owner of the building we're standing in. The reporters had started asking questions, their cameras capturing every moment of Wellington's humiliation. The airport police officers had stepped back, realizing that they were witnessing something much bigger than a routine security incident. Dr. Thompson had stood quietly through all of this, her dignity intact despite the ordeal she'd been put through. Now, as the truth was revealed, she stepped forward to address the crowd. "I want to be clear," she'd said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned every bit of respect she commanded. "I didn't reveal my ownership of this airport to intimidate anyone or to receive special treatment. I expected to be treated with the same respect and dignity that every passenger deserves. The fact that I own this building is irrelevant to how I should be treated as a human being." She'd paused, letting that sink in before continuing. "However, as the owner of this airport, I have a responsibility to ensure that no other passenger is subjected to the discriminatory treatment I experienced this morning. What happened here today is unacceptable, and it ends now. Wellington had tried one last desperate attempt to save his career. Dr. Thompson, I was just doing my job. I didn't know. I was following procedures. But Dr. Thompson had held up her hand, stopping him mid-sentence. Mr. Wellington, you were following your own prejudices, not airport procedures. You saw a black woman with nice clothes and expensive accessories, and you assumed she didn't belong. You decided that she must be lying, that her credentials must be fake, that she was somehow a threat to your authority. She gestured to the cameras and reporters surrounding them. But here's what you failed to understand. Success doesn't change the color of my skin. Wealth doesn't eliminate the prejudice I face. Owning this airport doesn't protect me from discrimination. What happened to me this morning happens to thousands of people every day, and most of them don't have the resources to fight back. The crowd had begun to murmur, some people nodding in agreement, others looking uncomfortable as they realized they were witnessing something historic. But I do have those resources, Dr. Thompson had continued, and I'm going to use them to make sure this never happens again. What happened next unfolded with the swift efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Dr. Thompson's team had been preparing for this moment from the second she'd made her phone call. And now they executed their plan with military precision. Rebecca Washington had stepped forward with a folder of documents that would change Wellington's life forever. Mr. Wellington, she'd said, her voice carrying the weight of legal authority, you are hereby terminated from your position as Security Chief of Metropolitan International Airport, effective immediately. You are also banned from all airport property pending the outcome of federal civil rights investigations. She'd handed him a formal termination letter while cameras rolled and reporters took notes. Furthermore, she'd continued, the Department of Justice has been notified of your pattern of discriminatory behavior, and they will be conducting a full investigation into potential civil rights violations. The FBI's Civil Rights Division will be reviewing all security footage and incident reports from your tenure as Security Chief. Wellington had stood there in shock, the termination letter trembling in his hands as he realized that his career in law enforcement was over. But the consequences were just beginning. David Kim had addressed the TSA agents who had been working under Wellington's supervision. Any employee who participated in or failed to report discriminatory behavior will be subject to immediate review, he'd announced. However, any employee who was coerced into participating or who attempted to resist discriminatory orders will be protected under whistleblower provisions. Several agents had immediately stepped forward, confirming that they had been pressured to participate in Wellington's discriminatory practices and that they had tried to file complaints that were buried by management. Marcus Chen had taken over security operations, immediately implementing new protocols designed to prevent discriminatory behavior. Effective immediately, he'd announced. All additional security screenings must be justified in writing with specific security concerns. All screenings will be recorded and reviewed by supervisory personnel. Any pattern of targeting passengers based on race, ethnicity, religion, or appearance will result in immediate termination. But Dr. Thompson wasn't finished. She had bigger changes in mind. This incident has revealed systematic problems that go beyond one individual, she'd told the crowd. We're implementing a complete overhaul of security training, hiring practices, and oversight procedures. We're also establishing a passenger rights office with direct reporting to my executive team. She'd turned to address Wellington directly, her voice carrying a mixture of authority and disappointment. Mr. Wellington, you had the opportunity to serve the public with dignity and respect. Instead, you chose to abuse your authority and discriminate against people based on your own prejudices. You don't deserve to wear that badge, and you don't deserve to have authority over other people. The airport police officers had stepped forward to escort Wellington from the premises. But Dr. Thompson had one more thing to say. "I want you to remember this moment," she'd said, her voice carrying across the terminal. "I want you to remember that the woman you tried to humiliate owns the ground you're standing on. But more importantly, I want you to remember that every person you've discriminated against was somebody's mother, somebody's daughter, somebody's hero. They all deserved better than what you gave them." As Wellington was escorted away, his career in ruins and his reputation destroyed, the crowd had erupted in applause. But Dr. Thompson wasn't done implementing changes. Over the next several hours, Dr. Thompson's team worked to implement comprehensive changes that would prevent similar incidents in the future. What had started as a personal experience with discrimination had become a catalyst for airport-wide reform. Rebecca Washington had established a legal hotline for passengers who had experienced discrimination at the airport. Within the first hour, dozens of calls had come in from people sharing their own stories of mistreatment. Each call was being documented and investigated. "We're not just addressing today's incident," she'd explained to reporters. "We're conducting a comprehensive review of all security practices and passenger complaints from the past 5 years. Every instance of potential discrimination will be investigated and addressed." David Kim had begun interviewing airport employees about their experiences working under Wellington's management. The stories that emerged painted a picture of systematic intimidation and discrimination that went far beyond what had been captured in official reports. Several employees have come forward to report that they were pressured to target certain passengers for additional screening, he'd explained. They were told that failure to comply would result in poor performance reviews and potential termination. "We're implementing new whistleblower protections to ensure that employees can report discriminatory behavior without fear of retaliation." Marcus Chen had begun implementing new training programs that would be mandatory for all security personnel. "Every employee will undergo comprehensive bias training," he'd announced. "They will learn to recognize and address their own prejudices, and they will be held accountable for treating all passengers with dignity and respect." But the most significant change was the establishment of the Thompson Institute for Airport Equity and Justice, a research and advocacy organization that would work to eliminate discrimination in transportation security nationwide. "What happened to me today happens to countless people every day," Dr. Thompson had explained to reporters. "Most of them don't have the resources to fight back. This institute will provide those resources. We'll investigate discrimination, provide legal support to victims, and work to change policies and practices throughout the transportation industry." The institute would be funded with a $10 million initial investment from Dr. Thompson personally, with additional funding from Thompson Holdings and other corporate partners. James Rodriguez had coordinated with civil rights organizations to amplify the message beyond just this one incident. "This is about more than one airport or one security chief," he'd explained. "This is about a culture of discrimination that exists throughout our transportation system. We're going to change that culture, one airport at a time if necessary." The media coverage had been overwhelming. Major news networks had picked up the story, and it was being covered internationally as an example of how individual action could create systematic change. But for Dr. Thompson, the most important part of the day was still ahead of her. After hours of dealing with the aftermath of Wellington's discrimination, Dr. Thompson had finally been cleared to board her flight to her daughter's graduation. The airline had held the plane for her, and the crew had been briefed on the situation. As she walked through the airport toward her gate, something remarkable happened. Passengers and employees began recognizing her from the news coverage, and they started applauding. Not because she was rich or powerful, but because she had stood up to discrimination and used her resources to create change. "Thank you," one elderly black woman had said, tears in her eyes. My grandson is about to start traveling for work, and I was so worried about what he might face. Thank you for making it safer for him. A young Latino woman had approached her with her phone, showing her a video message. My daughter is at school, and she wanted me to tell you that you're her hero. She says she wants to be a doctor, just like you. But the most meaningful moment came when a TSA agent, one of the ones who had been pressured to participate in Wellington's discriminatory practices, had approached her quietly. "Dr. Thompson," he'd said, "I want to apologize. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I was afraid to speak up. I have a family to support, and I couldn't afford to lose my job." Dr. Thompson had looked at him with understanding rather than judgment. "You're not the one who needs to apologize," she'd said. "You were put in an impossible situation by someone who abused his authority. But now you have the opportunity to be part of the solution. Help us make sure this never happens again." As she'd boarded the plane, Dr. Thompson had reflected on the day's events. She'd left home that morning, planning to attend her daughter's graduation with a surprise gift. Now she was arriving not just as a proud mother, but as someone who had sparked a movement for change. The leather portfolio still contained the deed papers for the medical practice she was gifting to her daughter, but it also contained something new: documentation of the systematic changes she'd implemented to protect other travelers from discrimination. During the flight, she'd received constant updates from her team. The story was being covered by every major news outlet. The hashtag airport discrimination had generated millions of social media posts. The Thompson Institute had received hundreds of calls from people wanting to share their own stories of discrimination. But most importantly, other airports were reaching out to learn about the new policies and procedures she'd implemented. The change was spreading beyond Metropolitan International Airport. Dr. Thompson arrived at Harvard Medical School just as the graduation ceremony was beginning. She'd managed to make it despite everything that had happened, and she was determined not to let Wellington's racism overshadow her daughter's incredible achievement. As she took her seat in the auditorium, her phone buzzed with a text from Zoe. "Mom, I saw the news. Are you okay? I'm so proud of you for standing up to that man." Dr. Thompson smiled, typing back, "I'm here, and I'm so proud of you. Today is about your accomplishment. We'll talk about everything else later." The ceremony was beautiful, and when Zoe walked across the stage to receive her diploma, Dr. Thompson felt tears streaming down her face. Her daughter was graduating valedictorian, just as she had 23 years earlier. But Zoe's path would be different. Thanks to what had happened today, it would be a little easier. After the ceremony, Dr. Thompson found Zoe in the crowd of celebrating graduates. Her daughter was radiant in her cap and gown, surrounded by classmates and professors congratulating her on her achievements. "Mom," Zoe had called out, pushing through the crowd to embrace her mother. "I can't believe what happened today. Are you really okay?" "I'm fine, sweetheart," Dr. Thompson had said, holding her daughter close. "But more importantly, how are you feeling? This is your day." Zoe had stepped back, looking at her mother with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Mom, what you did today, it's going to change everything. Not just for you, but for everyone who looks like us. I've already had 3 classmates tell me their stories about discrimination they faced. They said seeing you stand up like that gave them hope." Dr. Thompson had smiled, reaching into her portfolio to pull out the surprise she'd been planning for months. "Speaking of hope," she'd said, "I have something for you." She'd handed Zoe the deed papers for the medical practice, watching her daughter's eyes widen as she read the documents. "Mom, this is too much. I can't accept this." "Yes, you can," Dr. Thompson had said firmly. "This is your starting point. Not your ending point, but your beginning. You're going to do incredible things, Zoe. You're going to save lives, advance medical science, and yes, you're going to face people who will try to tear you down because of what you look like. just off. She'd paused, thinking about Wellington and all the other barriers she'd faced throughout her career. But you won't face them alone, she'd continued. You'll have resources, you'll have support, and you'll have the knowledge that you have every right to be in whatever room you enter. This practice is your foundation. Build something amazing on top of it. Zoe had hugged her mother again, both of them crying now. I love you, Mom, and I'm going to make you proud. You already have, sweetheart. You already have. 6 months later, the changes Dr. Thompson had implemented at Metropolitan International Airport had created a ripple effect throughout the aviation industry. The Thompson Institute for Airport Equity and Justice had documented over 400 cases of discrimination at airports nationwide, leading to policy changes, employee terminations, and legal settlements. Marcus Wellington had been convicted of federal civil rights violations and sentenced to 2 years in prison. His case had become a landmark example of how individual acts of discrimination could be prosecuted under federal law. More importantly, his conviction had sent a message to other security personnel that discriminatory behavior would have real consequences. The training programs implemented at Metropolitan International had been adopted by 47 other airports across the country. The Passenger Rights Office had handled over 1,200 complaints, leading to systematic changes in how airports address discrimination. But the most significant impact was on the individuals who had been inspired by Dr. Thompson's stand. Hundreds of people had come forward to share their own stories of discrimination, creating a national conversation about bias in transportation security. Dr. Thompson had testified before Congress about the need for federal oversight of airport security practices. Her testimony had led to new legislation requiring standardized anti-discrimination training for all TSA personnel and creating federal oversight mechanisms for investigating bias complaints. Zoe had started her residency at Johns Hopkins, following in her mother's footsteps, but forging her own path. The medical practice her mother had gifted her was being used to provide free healthcare to underserved communities while Zoe completed her training. I want to use this gift the way you would, Zoe had told her mother, to help people who might not otherwise have access to quality healthcare. Dr. Thompson had never been more proud. 1 year after the incident at Metropolitan International Airport, Dr. Thompson returned to the same terminal where she had been humiliated. But this time, she wasn't traveling as a passenger. She was there for the dedication of the Wellington Memorial Training Center, a facility named not to honor Marcus Wellington, but to ensure that his actions would never be forgotten. The center was designed to train security personnel from airports across the country on recognizing and preventing discrimination. It featured interactive simulations, bias training programs, and testimonials from victims of discrimination. As Dr. Thompson cut the ribbon to officially open the center, she was surrounded by many of the same people who had witnessed her humiliation a year earlier. But now they were there to celebrate the changes that had emerged from that dark moment. A year ago, I was standing in this terminal, being treated like a criminal, she told the crowd. Today, I'm standing here as proof that discrimination doesn't have to be the end of the story. It can be the beginning of change. The crowd included Marcus Wellington's former colleagues, many of whom had undergone the new training programs and had become advocates for fair treatment of all passengers. It included passengers who had been discriminated against in the past, but now felt safer traveling. And it included young people who had been inspired by Dr. Thompson's example to pursue careers in medicine, law, and civil rights. We can't change the past, Dr. Thompson had said, but we can shape the future. Every person who walks through this airport deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. every person who travels anywhere deserves that same treatment. She'd paused, looking around at the crowd of faces representing different races, ethnicities, religions, and backgrounds. This is what America looks like, she'd said. This is what our airports should look like. This is what respect looks like. The applause had been thunderous. But for Dr. Thompson, the most meaningful moment came when a young black girl, about 8 years old, had approached her after the ceremony. "Miss Doctor," the girl had said, "my mom says you're the lady who stood up to the mean man at the airport." Dr. Thompson had knelt down to the girl's level. "That's right," she'd said. "What's your name?" "I'm Destiny," the girl had replied. "My mom says that because of what you did, when I grow up and travel on airplanes, people will be nicer to me." Dr. Thompson had felt tears welling up in her eyes. "That's exactly right, Destiny. And do you know what? When you grow up..." "But I also think about all the people who stood up before me," she'd continued. "The people who fought for civil rights when it was much more dangerous to do so. The people who opened doors so that I could walk through them. I was just continuing their work." Zoe had smiled at her mother's humility. "Mom, you changed an entire industry. You created a movement. You gave people hope." "No, sweetheart," Dr. Thompson had replied. "I just refuse to be silent in the face of injustice. The change came from everyone who joined that fight. The security agents who finally felt safe to report discrimination. The passengers who shared their stories. The lawmakers who passed new legislation. The airport executives who implemented new policies. The young people who decided to pursue careers in civil rights." She gestured toward the window, where they could see Metropolitan International Airport in the distance. "Change doesn't come from one person," she'd said. "It comes from one person inspiring another, who inspires another, who inspires another. That's how we build a better world." 10 years after the incident, Dr. Thompson was invited to give the keynote speech at Harvard Medical School's graduation ceremony. As she stood at the podium where her daughter had once received her diploma, she looked out at a sea of faces representing the future of medicine. 10 years ago, she began, "I was humiliated at an airport by a man who looked at me and saw only what he expected to see. He saw a black woman who he assumed didn't belong, didn't deserve respect, didn't have the right to be treated with dignity." The auditorium was silent, every graduate hanging on her words. But what he didn't see was a woman who had fought for everything she had achieved. He didn't see a mother who was traveling to celebrate her daughter's incredible accomplishment. He didn't see a successful businesswoman who had invested millions to save the very airport where she was being mistreated. She paused, scanning the faces in the crowd. Most importantly, he didn't see a human being who deserved basic respect, regardless of her race, her gender, or her background. Dr. Thompson had stepped closer to the microphone, her voice carrying across the auditorium with the authority of someone who had lived through discrimination and emerged stronger. "You are about to enter a profession where you will have the power to heal, to save lives, and to make a difference in the world. But you will also have the power to perpetuate discrimination or to fight against it. You will have the power to see only what you expect to see, or to see the full humanity in every person you encounter." She gestured to the diverse group of graduates before her. "Look around you," she'd said. "Look at the faces of your classmates. These are the people who will be your colleagues, your partners, your friends. They come from different backgrounds, different ethnicities, different religions, different economic circumstances. But they all have one thing in common. They all earned their place here." The graduates had begun to applaud, but Dr. Thompson had held up her hand. "The question is not whether you deserve to be here," she'd said. "The question is what you will do with the opportunity you've been given. Will you use your privilege to open doors for others? Will you speak up when you see discrimination? Will you fight for justice even when it's difficult? She'd paused, thinking about all the changes that had emerged from one moment of standing up to injustice. 10 years ago, I could have stayed silent, she'd said. I could have accepted the discrimination, boarded my plane, and moved on with my life. But I chose to speak up. I chose to fight back, and that choice created a ripple effect that is still spreading today. She'd pointed to the graduates. Each of you has that same choice ahead of you. Each of you has the power to create change, to fight injustice, to make the world a little more fair for everyone. The applause had been thunderous, but Dr. Thompson had one more thing to say. I want you to remember something, she'd said, her voice carrying over the applause. You belong here. You deserve to be here, and no one, no matter what position they hold or what authority they claim, has the right to make you feel otherwise. She'd smiled at the graduates, thinking about the young woman she had been when she'd sat in similar seats decades earlier. Go out there and change the world, she'd said. And when someone tries to tell you that you don't belong, remember that you own the ground you're standing on, not because of your wealth or your power, but because of your humanity. Today, 15 years after the incident at Metropolitan International Airport, Dr. Amara Thompson continues to fight for justice and equality. The Thompson Institute for Airport Equity and Justice has expanded internationally, working with airports and transportation systems around the world to eliminate discrimination. The training programs she implemented have been adopted by over 300 airports globally. The legal precedents established by her case have been used to protect countless travelers from discrimination. The scholarship programs she created have helped hundreds of young people pursue careers in medicine, law, and civil rights. But perhaps most importantly, her example has inspired millions of people to stand up to discrimination when they encounter it. The hashtag airport discrimination, which started as documentation of one woman's mistreatment, has become a rallying cry for justice in transportation and beyond. Marcus Wellington served his prison sentence and was released 6 years ago. He has never worked in law enforcement again and has reportedly struggled to find employment due to his criminal record and the notoriety of his case. Several attempts to reach him for comment about the lasting impact of his actions have been unsuccessful. The TSA agents who were pressured to participate in Wellington's discriminatory practices have all received additional training and remain employed in various capacities. Several have become advocates for fair treatment of passengers and have spoken publicly about the importance of resisting pressure to discriminate. Metropolitan International Airport has become a model for fair and respectful treatment of all passengers. It has won numerous awards for customer service and has been recognized by civil rights organizations as a leader in eliminating discrimination in transportation. Dr. Zoe Thompson has followed in her mother's footsteps, becoming not just a successful surgeon, but also a prominent advocate for civil rights. She recently announced the establishment of the Zoe Thompson Foundation, which provides free medical care to underserved communities and fights discrimination in healthcare. My mother taught me that success isn't just about what you achieve, Zoe said in a recent interview. It's about what you do with that success to help others. It's about using your platform to fight for justice and equality. The leather portfolio that Dr. Thompson carried that day still sits in her office, now filled with awards, commendations, and letters from people whose lives have been changed by her example. But the most treasured item in that portfolio is a handwritten note from Destiny, the 8-year-old girl who approached her at the dedication ceremony years earlier. The note, written in careful cursive, reads, "Dear Dr. Thompson, I am now in medical school because of what you showed me. Thank you for proving that people like us can own the ground we stand on. I will never forget. Love, Dr. Destiny Johnson. Dr. Thompson often reflects on that day 15 years ago when she was humiliated at the airport. She thinks about how one moment of discrimination became a catalyst for change that is still spreading around the world. People sometimes ask me if I'm angry about what happened, she says, but I'm not angry anymore. I'm grateful. That moment of discrimination revealed an injustice that needed to be addressed. It gave me the opportunity to create change. It showed me the power of standing up for what's right. She pauses, looking out at the city skyline from her office window. But I'm most grateful for the reminder that we all have the power to make a difference. We all have the power to stand up to discrimination. We all have the power to create change. We just have to choose to use it. The story of Dr. Amara Thompson and Security Chief Marcus Wellington has become more than just a tale of individual discrimination and justice. It has become a symbol of the power of standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. It has become a reminder that change is possible when people refuse to accept injustice. And it has become proof that sometimes the person you're discriminating against might just own the ground you're standing on, not because of their wealth or power, but because of their humanity and their right to be treated with dignity and respect. The fight for justice continues, one airport at a time, one person at a time, one moment of courage at a time. If this story has inspired you to stand up against discrimination in your own life, remember that you have the power to create change. You don't need to own an airport or have millions of dollars. You just need the courage to speak up when you see injustice. Subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you don't miss more stories of courage, justice, and positive change. Tell us in the comments about a time when you stood up to discrimination, or share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Remember, you belong wherever you have the right to be. You deserve to be treated with dignity and respect. And when someone tries to tell you otherwise, you have the power to prove them wrong. Type justice in the comments if you believe that every person deserves to be treated fairly, regardless of their race, religion, gender, or background. Tell us where you're watching from, and let's build a global community of people committed to fighting discrimination wherever we find it. Together, we can create a world where no one has to endure what Dr. Thompson experienced that day. Together, we can make sure that justice prevails. The story may be over, but the fight for justice continues. And it continues with each of us, every day, in every choice we make to stand up for what's right.